Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review two films. One, The Hills Have Eyes, and the other, the Dwayne The Rock Johnson movie. Dwayne Johnson movie. Skyscraper. Both of which you can either see on Amazon Prime or on Cinemax with Amazon Prime. At the end of the day, we're going to go out of our way to review both of these films. I am actually just going to review the skyscraper film first, and then I'm going to review The Hills Have Eyes right after that. So, anyways, just to let you know, if you guys are brand new to all this, I tend to normally review a lot of these things in a very cryptic like sense. We give a double 5 time count, and then we go into spoiler sense. So, let's cryptically talk about the movie Skyscraper. This movie seemed like every single thing about it was timed to the utter second. That everything had to be so forcibly like, oh my god, he has perfect timing for everything. There was a lot of scary s like things, really showcasing kind of height, and I was just like, ugh. There were some cringe moments of that where I was just kind of like, ugh. There was a lot of times in which I'm like, man, do you really have to go and show like the depth of which this person has to go and jump through things or jump to things or jump off things or almost fall from things, etc., etc. Um, but yeah, of course, you have to do that with a skyscraper s like movie. I think that this movie got way too goofy. Um, Goofy in a not a good way. There's too many goofy things going on within this movie to where it immediately just kind of made me just kind of go like, well, of course, this just has to get more bizarre and obscure to the point to where there's no way in hell that anybody would try to go about doing this. And it continues to go that route. Within this movie, we have it to where ultimately everything perfectly works out for Dwayne and his family within this film. Bizarrely, there is an opening scene in this movie that honestly doesn't need to be opened and or seen because it has nothing to do honestly with the actual story. Some, and I say verily some, scenes in this movie um weren't exactly a surprise because otherwise that's what you have a trailer for. Dwayne in this movie plays Dwayne again. It's not like he plays anything like an outstretched character or a character dealing with a struggle of really something. He's just playing Dwayne again, and this man never really seems to, rarely if ever, show any range of anything. But he's still handed script after script after script after script to where it doesn't even make sense anymore. But it is what it is. Uh, Within this film, too much about it is superly overly coincidental. It gets to the point where I just think that there is like it gets to almost comic relief within this movie. I think that's kind of where you really want to go and watch this movie. Just to see how goofy this movie really is. To honestly see how like unimportant really the story is in this movie because there is no real story. It's just action scenes and people like, how are they gonna evade all of this? How are they gonna get through all of this? And that's the only real journey. Um, a lot of people would consistently match this up with a movie like Die Hard, and I would honestly and truly ultimately say, how? It has no quality of anything like Die Hard. Um, the story doesn't really go really heavily in a Die Hard like route. It's not. It's like, if you want to call it like a Die Hard film, it's maybe like 5% of what Die Hard is, kind of. I would probably say it's much more of maybe a Poseidon like film, just because of how obscure that people have to go out of the way to eventually get to where they need to go and get to where they have to survive through this, and be able to get to where they need to go to get people to safety. I feel more that this is more like Poseidon than anything else, or maybe like a Towering Inferno, or some other kind of like building gone awry adventure than anything else. I don't feel that this is Die Hard at all. Die Hard would actually mean uh, that Dwayne Johnson was actually in the building for a bulk of the time. That there was a bulk of people having to get killed throughout most of this film. Reasonably, Dwayne doesn't actually arrive in the actual building when stuff hits the fan until 50 minutes in. 50 minutes in, we had to wait for a backstory, which was relevant. We had to wait for a jostling of, oh, okay, this person needs to go here and this person needs to go there, and we have to have this little trinket thing presented for Dwayne to hold on to, this and that, for no reasons. Yeah, just the movie is just kind of, it's fun to see how bad it is. I think that's the real takeaway from this movie. It's good to see how bad it is. Um, it's honestly really nice to see a bad Dwayne the Rock Johnson movie. I like those. I kind of hold those on to just be like, yeah, this is the reason why you shouldn't have this actor in every film, because not all of them are good. So that's what I liked about this film, is I don't feel that it was a good film, no matter if it made a lot of money or not. I just feel that this was a waste of time to even put together and do. It just, there was no story because there wasn't going to be. This is perfectly incarnate having a star sell a film, because nothing else could sell this film. Nothing else could sell it. Nothing at all could sell this film besides Dwayne. So hopefully he made a load of money off of this movie, because I could not otherwise justify that this movie was probably a one-off film and they will never make a sequel, because why would they? Anyways, I think now it's about that time to get into spoilers about this movie, because ultimately, at the end of the day, I could say probably a lot of people probably won't go out of their way to watch this film. But I don't know, I just enjoyed it for the god awful quality that it presented. Just god awful all around. It was so goofy. It was so just, what was this attempt at even trying to make a backstory for this character? which ultimately just rendered pointless because of the consistent pattern of wasting of time that this movie gave us. But again, um I liked seeing a bad Dwayne Johnson movie. I really did. I like those. I enjoy those because ultimately, again, it's showing its ugly rear head that this guy cannot do a great movie all the time. He can't knock it out of the park all the time. Spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to ruin this film. So we have Dwayne the Rock Johnson as a military person, which I'm like, yeah, of course. He ultimately is a army negotiator. Why not just make him a former cop that is a negotiator and goes into some environment where there is a father holding a son, and the son ultimately, um, after the father sets him down, has a bomb strapped to him and detonates the bomb and basically just destroys Dwayne the Rock Johnson, sending him to a hospital to get rehabilitated, where he meets Nev Campbell's character. Shoehorn them getting married, having kids, and then ultimately leading a life in China, I'm assuming, or in Asia, with a building that looks very obscure, has a bizarrish pearl and or tennis ball at the top of it. So we have it to where, dare say, Nev Campbell and her two kids are ultimately in this building looking at this exhibit, which they honestly weren't actually supposed to, because they shouldn't have been staying at that building for a very long period of time, because there's going to be a crime being done. There's going to be a building being burnt down by certain chemicals where if you mix water in it, it burns even more. To where Rock, or toward Dwayne, has to ultimately, bizarrely, climb up to this point on this crane, and then ultimately, like, stretch the crane to where it hits the building, to where he absolutely has to jump off said crane to hit the building. Which I'm like, oh, so this is like setting us up to where like everything for The Rock or for Dwayne has the best bizarrish timing, which doesn't make any sense. But whatever, I guess this is just how it's gonna be set up for this entire time. Where I was just scared of just like Dwayne just falling to his death, and that's where I was like, ugh. So we end up having Dwayne not only just bizarrely have his family all raring to go, to just be really good at balancing acts of trying to, dare say, go out of the way to be where Dwayne is, but then ultimately they have to have this bridge that falls, and ultimately they have to get the kid across the bridge, and stuff goes sideways. To ultimately, The Rock has to have an elevator take the brake down for her to manually press the brake. So this girl has to slide all the way down quickly with this elevator to quickly press this lever. And I'm just like, okay, sure. Another perfect move here. Because Rock appears at the perfect time to save his family, and so everything has to be perfect in this movie, goofily enough. To where the daughter is kidnapped by one of the hooligans. I'm like, yeah, of course. Of course. Um, to where ultimately he has to go and save her by going to some unique way of getting to this one guy who otherwise has these plans. Because ultimately, before all this, we had it to where The Rock had some bizarre imprinting book of his face, to where his best friend turned on him, and ultimately they had a fight out. They had a shootout, and Dwayne kills his quasi best friend. Which I don't even know if it was his best friend because there's no backstory to that. Because heaven forbid you could do backstory for anything in this movie. Um, but yeah, so we have to her ultimately going back. Dwayne ultimately has to get this guy to otherwise go into this room where there's this last goon, and it's in this mirror-esque like room where the guy that was with him, the Asian guy, had like presented this room before. Now Dwayne has just outsmarted this other guy by mirrors and stuff like that, and ultimately getting to where this guy dies, gets his daughter, and they're like, "Yeah, woo, we're good, woo, oh, excuse me, we're gonna be saved." And yeah, everybody gets saved. Um, there was several times within this movie I was just kind of like, this is like we haven't done a movie about a building that isn't quite all there in a while, but man, did this feel not original? Did it feel not? You really didn't have a fear of this building doing anything. You really didn't have a fear of. The only thing that mattered was that Dwayne was going to win out of all of this because he's Dwayne. And there was never a time where you were just kind of like, okay, now we know that everything is ridiculously timed, so everything is going to work out so perfectly. It's going to be amazing. And that's what this movie ends up being. So, moving on. The Hills Have Eyes. I had never seen this film, but again, I've kind of started to see a lot of films that I wouldn't normally. Silent Hill is kind of one of those. Any of the Rob Zombie films was kind of one of those. So ultimately, I started to go into just flipping through some movies that I could dare say see, and The Hills Have Eyes was one of them. I I think I had seen a little bit of this movie at one portion of time, but in my mind, never really fully fledgedly seen this entire film. I actually did enjoy it. I did feel that the movie was another one of those where it's kind of very simple but yet effective. I I felt that the movie was kind of slow because with a bunch of deserters kind of attaching themselves onto strangers to ultimately get back at them for ultimately being people on the other side of the sword that don't look like freaks like them. Uh, yeah, it's excuse me. The Hills Have Eyes is a story about people that are just looking for vacation, and it ultimately backfires on them. People who were just looking to get away found a way of getting more than just away. They ended up getting dead. Um, Reasonably, when looking at this movie, there might be a few known actors, but ultimately, a lot of them might have just been like, yeah, but when are these people gonna die? 'Cause that seems to be a lot of which the roles which in this movie play. It's like, well, who's eventually going to get killed? Who's eventually going to die? So within this movie, we have it to where, like I said, it's a simple story about um people who ultimately go on vacation and wind up, instead of getting away, get to be killed one by one, seemingly, by deserters who ultimately have been in a bombed like city or bombed like environment. Uh, they were in place of which they they turned into freaks because ultimately they had a bomb dropped upon them at some point. Um, that is the backstory of the characters. Is that ultimately they were in a wrong place at the wrong time, getting bomb dropped on them, and so ultimately their issue was the fact that they had turned into all freaks because of the bomb that was dropped upon them, leading to the fact where everything after that is just kind of like the normal, like Resident Evil, Silent Hill kind of like who's gonna die and who's gonna fight off who and what interesting environments are gonna be placed within this. Yeah. So I think it's about around that time to go into spoiler territory about this movie, because there's not much to say in otherwise way about this movie than to get into spoilers. So let's do so. I didn't think that this movie was bad. I didn't think that this movie was great either, but I just thought it was a good filler of time in my mind. Um, so let's get into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. I wouldn't say ruin this movie because I don't feel it was all that bad. Um, I feel like there wasn't enough story, but for a movie that is kind of very much like Rob Zombie films don't really have to have much story. They just need to be a thing. And so I could always go out of my way to just say, like, there's some movies that don't exactly need to have a story, as long as you are either invested in characters or you can easily understand what is, dare say, kind of going on at some points. So we have it to where ultimately his family is just kind of stuck in the middle of nowhere, where the father and the father is going to the gas station, ultimately leading the family to fend for themselves, and ultimately that is what happens. The father goes off to eventually go into the gas station, where a gas station is unattended because the guy who attends said gas station is eventually going to kill himself. Because ultimately he is surrounded by what is these hillbilly esque people that are out to get him. To where the father is ending up running for his life, but the one place that he decides to uh, come back to safety was this car, leading to where there was a guy in the back of the seat that was waiting to kill him, which ultimately he does. But doesn't quite, because ultimately he leaves him to burn on some stake later on in the movie, right in front of his family. To where ultimately, while this is going on, one of the other berserker like people are hiding in the trailer with the youngest daughter, and is having a little fun with him, let's just say. Cue up to where the other daughter goes in the trailer and ultimately gets fondled and taken advantage of. And let's just say had a little suck a little. Had a little bit of sucking. Blah, blah, blah. Had it to where ultimately one of the bizarre people ultimately noticed that this is this girl's baby and decided to otherwise uh, taste the mother's milk himself, let's just say. Leading to her eventually, the mother of said family comes back in to ultimately ward off. Ultimately leading to her getting a bullet. Ultimately to her the oldest daughter ended up getting bullet as well. But eventually, it gets to the point to where the only people that are left standing is the husband of said oldest daughter and then the brother and sister. Because everybody else is just dead at this point. Except for the baby. The baby is just kind of hot potatoed. To where you don't even know where the baby is. It gets to the point to where the brother and sister are kind of hiding out in the trailer, but eventually they do some uh, tricks to otherwise blow up the trailer. Propane and matchsticks and stuff like that. Ultimately leading one of these berserker people into the trailer for them to get exploded or get dead. All the while you have the husband and or boyfriend from the oldest daughter that is eventually trying to find his baby from which it had vanished. To where he goes in deep down into what is this housing environment, as well as finding all these berserkers with all these weird weaponry and stuff like that, and axes and all these kinds of bizarre things, as well as the brother of said two daughters or said two sisters. He had mentioned before that there was like a lot of bizarre berserker looking people that he ended up finding before. Now, this guy otherwise is going through this house and eventually tries to find this baby, finds the baby, and gets knocked out for his trouble. Ends up in the end trying to find the baby again, but ends up finding this one disfigured character that is ultimately telling him the backstory of this family. Then ultimately another family member appears to attack him with an axe. Eventually, getting the best of this guy with the axe, goofy looking guy, eventually gets to the point to where, okay, where's the baby? It kind of gets to the point where they kind of have to kill every single one of these berserkers to eventually get the kid. There's a mad scramble because there's so many like goofy looking characters having the kid, but they do eventually get the kid back. Ultimately, where it seems like even with them killing every single one of these berserkers, it's just the rhyme or reason of just like, well, yeah, but they still have nowhere to go. So yeah, the movie just kind of ends with them ceremoniously being all reconnected back together, and they're just like, yeah, you have the baby, yeah, you guys are okay, yeah, ooh. And then like that's how the movie like pretty much ends, because there's not much to really just do after that. There's not really much of where to go. So it was an interesting movie. I liked it. but overall, I just kind of I don't think there was enough there. I wish there was. I wish there was more there to really go really into. But you can't really sink your teeth into this movie because there's nothing enough there to really latch onto and just really go, yeah, I'm really enjoying this. I really just kind of just thought it was a good waste of however much of time. And in my mind, I guess that's just good enough. So I think at the end of the day, I think that review is just good enough. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.